Story 1. The Silent Neighbor. I've lived in this apartment building for over a year, and at first, everything was fine. I was used to the hum of the old plumbing, the creaks in the walls, and the sounds of neighbors coming and going. But there was one tenant I never really saw, the man in 3B. It wasn't that I didn't try to meet him. I've always been a friendly person, and I liked the idea of knowing the people I lived near. But whenever I would see the door to 3B cracked open, no one was ever there. I'd knock on the door, but no one ever answered. The landlord told me he'd only ever seen the man once, and that was when he was signing the lease. He didn't seem to care much about it, just another tenant. But I was curious. Something about 3B felt off. I didn't mind at first. I had my routine, and the other neighbors were decent enough. But after a few months, something started to change. Every night, at exactly 2 a.m., I'd hear it, the sound of footsteps pacing across the floor in 3B. It started out faint, just a few slow steps, but as the nights went on, it got louder, more deliberate. Step, step, step. The sound would echo through the walls, keeping me awake. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, the way old houses creak and groan. But then I began to hear the way the footsteps slowed down, then sped up, as if the person inside the apartment was walking in circles. Sometimes, I could hear a muffled bang, like something heavy hitting the ground. Then, silence. Just enough time for me to start to drift back to sleep before it would start again. It became a routine. I would stay up, staring at the ceiling, listening to those footsteps until they stopped, and then I would finally manage to fall asleep. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the noise started to get to me. It wasn't the kind of noise that felt random. It was deliberate, methodical, and each night, it felt like it was getting closer, like someone was inching toward my door. One evening, I ran into the landlord in the hallway. He was talking to another tenant, and they mentioned that 3B had been vacant for months. I stopped in my tracks. Vacant? I asked. But I hear someone in there all the time, pacing. The landlord paused, his expression shifting from casual to something I couldn't place. He frowned and quickly changed the subject. No one's supposed to be in 3B. That was the moment everything shifted. My mind raced. No one was supposed to be in 3B. I'd been hearing pacing noises in the middle of the night for months from an apartment that, according to the landlord, was empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, after I finished work, I decided to check it out. I'd been hearing the sounds for weeks, and now I had to know. Maybe it was just some leftover noise from the previous tenant, I thought. But no. My curiosity got the better of me, and I couldn't resist. I needed to know who or what was in 3B. I waited until the building was quiet, long after the other tenants had gone to bed. The lights in the hallway flickered as I walked down, and the floorboards creaked under my feet. The building felt empty at that hour. When I reached 3B, I stood outside for a moment, my heart thudding in my chest. There was no sound, no footsteps, nothing. I reached out and gently twisted the door handle. It gave slightly. The door wasn't locked. My breath caught in my throat. What was I doing? I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what was behind that door. But the more I stood there, the more my hand moved on its own. I opened the door just a crack. The apartment was dark, too dark. I could see the faint outline of furniture against the windows, but the room was empty. Still, that feeling of unease flooded back. The room felt like it was waiting for me. I stepped in, slowly, careful not to make a sound. The air was thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in ages. Dust clung to everything, the furniture, the bookshelves, the kitchen counters. But the most unsettling part, the living room light was on. And the floor, it had fresh footprints, dark, heavy, almost like they were made by boots. They trailed across the carpet, leading straight to the wall. That was when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just next to the wall, was a small, cracked mirror. It wasn't tilted at an angle that would allow you to see yourself, but I could see something in the reflection that made my stomach drop. A figure, a shadow, someone or something standing in the corner of the room. I slammed the door and ran back to my apartment, my heart hammering in my chest. The next morning, I went to the landlord and demanded answers. He said he'd never seen anyone enter 3B since the original tenant had left. He even assured me the apartment was supposed to be vacant, but I couldn't shake what I saw. And when I moved out a few months later, the landlord said I wasn't the first tenant to feel uncomfortable in 3B. He'd had complaints about the noises too, but when they went in to check, no one was ever there. Story 2. The light in the garage. It started innocently enough. My wife and I had just moved into a new house in the suburbs, a little 2-story place with a backyard and an old garage. We had big plans fixing it up, making it our own. The garage had a small workbench, a few shelves, and enough space for our cars. It seemed like the perfect spot to store boxes and extra tools. But after a few weeks, something strange started happening. Every night, without fail, the garage light would flicker on. At first, I thought it was just a faulty switch, or maybe a loose connection. I wasn't too concerned. But after a few more nights, I became annoyed. It was almost as if the light was coming on its own and at strange hours. Sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes late in the afternoon. I tried to ignore it, but every time it happened, I'd go outside to turn it off. One night, I stayed up late working on a project in the living room, and I heard it again, the unmistakable flicker of the light in the garage. I didn't bother to check. I figured it was probably a wiring issue or something minor, but when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The next day, I told my wife about the light, and she shrugged it off. She wasn't the type to get scared easily. But that night, when the light flickered on again, I decided to take a closer look. I grabbed a flashlight and walked outside toward the garage. The door was slightly ajar, as it often was when I left it open to air out. I reached for the light switch, but then stopped. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something was off. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the faint light coming from inside. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. I pushed the door open further, stepping into the cold, dim space. The garage was empty, but then I noticed something. The workbench, which I'd tidied earlier that day, was covered in strange items. They weren't mine. There was a small wooden box sitting on the bench, and a pair of dirty shoes next to it. The shoes were scuffed, older than anything I'd owned. I felt a cold rush run through me. Someone had been in here. But who? I hadn't noticed anything before. I picked up the box. Inside was a photo of my house, taken from the backyard. It was old, but it clearly showed my back door and part of the garden. A chill ran through me. The box was filled with small, odd trinkets, mementos, but from someone else's life. Someone who had been watching me for a long time. I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, but the door was closed, and there was no one there. I checked the windows, locked. Everything was as it should be, except for the feeling in my chest that wouldn't let up. I bolted inside, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. But the light stayed on in the garage. I couldn't bring myself to go back out there. The next day, I installed a camera in the garage, just to be sure. I didn't expect anything to happen. I was trying to convince myself it was just an overactive imagination. But that night, when I checked the footage, I saw it. A shadow moving in the garage. Slowly, deliberately, the light flickered on by itself. Someone had been inside. I don't know who they were, But the box, the shoes, the photo, they were a warning. That's when I realized the light wasn't a glitch. It was a message.